Absolutely nothing went right trying to make this video, but I soldiered on and we're gonna get it done. The 2021 M1 powered iMac, a Wacom digital tablet, and flowers. Let's do this. Hey guys, welcome to Elevated Systems. I'm your host CJ, and as I continue to work with the 2021 iMac, one very popular piece of software I didn't get a chance to really test out on the M1 chip yet is Photoshop. Back in December when I was working with the M1 Mac Mini, Photoshop really hadn't been optimized for Apple Silicon yet. There was a beta version, but it was missing a lot of features like Camera Raw and a lot of the GPU accelerated features. However, since then, it's become a fully fledged version of Photoshop with all the bells and whistles. And it runs natively on Apple Silicon. So now I can properly take it for a test drive. However, there are already a ton of videos on people using M1 Macs and Photoshop, batch processing in Lightroom, and some simple and more complex photo editing. And while honestly, all I really use Photoshop for nowadays is, well, making thumbnails for these videos. In the past, I primarily used it for digital art. Art in all forms and media has been a hobby of mine since childhood, but today I'm gonna paint these flowers using the M1 iMac and my well-used Wacom Intuos 4 XL drawing tablet. Or more appropriately, I did paint these flowers yesterday, and I screen recorded the whole process, but for those of you who follow the channel may have seen the community post of the results. So basically, I have over 6 hours of just 4K black screen footage of what should have been screen capture, and then just footage of me sitting at my desk narrating as I work on a piece you can't actually see. So I'll show you the final piece and briefly explain the process and experience. As far as what went wrong with the screen capture, I have my suspicions, but I have to do more testing, so I'll include that in my final 1 month later review of the iMac. But anyway, this is the subject. This is about the angle I was observing from, and this is the final painting. Now, the overall experience was great. The image size I went with, or the final image anyway, was like 3,500 by 2,100 pixels at 300 DPI, giving me an over 21 megapixel image, and the technique was pretty basic. I just sketched it out. Going with flowers makes that easy, simple, organic shape, so you don't have to be overly precise. Then I just filled in colors with a simple round brush and blended everything together with a soft smudge tool, the blur tool, and a couple of texture brushes. As I went along, I made some changes to the general composition using the warp tool and the liquify filter, but keeping a non-destructive workflow, I duplicated the working layer prior to major composition changes, and the workflow was super smooth. I didn't run into any issues at all until about 4 hours in. Okay, so here it is, the dreaded spinny circle of, wait, let me catch up. Amazingly, I'm, 4 hours into this painting, and this is the first time the wheel is making me slow down at all. Yeah, it's not liking this too much. So you see, I have a textured brush here, and I'm just streaking some texture with some darker color into these petals here, and then following up with a soft smudge tool to blend as I go, but Photoshop is really starting to have problems redrawing the image as fast as I'm working. So first thing, I'm like 5 layers deep into this so far, so I'm happy with the layer I'm working on. So I'll go ahead and just delete out all these upper layers or lower layers, and I'll just keep layer 5 and 6, 6 the one I'm working on. Also, I can hit up the performance preferences up here, and yeah, let's increase the available memory to say 80% and definitely increase the cache level. Let's go with 6 and see how that works. And 6 worked good. As long as I kept up 2 or 3 layers, I didn't bog down the system, so no more spinny circles to slow me down. I'll actually show you all those settings in a minute, but first, the final piece came out pretty good. Now, I know not seeing me do digital art in a video about digital art is probably a letdown, or not. A lot of you may just be interested in how the iMac performs. So while I'm not going to do another 6+ hours of digital painting from scratch, I am going to do another type of project that will use some of the same techniques and will be even more demanding on the system. What I'm going to do is a photo manipulation. So I'm going to take a photo, this photo, which I found on an open source photo site, I'll leave a link below, and manually stylize it into a painted portrait. Now, this is a huge image with a lot of detail. It's not a raw image, so I don't have sensor log data, but at almost 100 megapixels, it should be a really good test of the capabilities. So the plan is to turn this photo into a digital oil painting, but manually, not by just applying some filter. So to make sure I get this thing captured this time, I'm going to move the iMac over here and plug it directly into my capture card. I tested that, it works, so let's do it. Now, because I'm working with an image size that's nearly 100 megapixels at 4800 pixels by 7200 pixels at a resolution of 300 dpi, I have my performance preferences set to 80% of available RAM use. I turn the history states down from 50 to 25. I set the cache level from the default of 3 or 4 up to 6, and then the cache tile size is 1024K. Okay, so I've already masked out and separated the subject from the background here, because while the composition for a photo is okay, for a painting, I want the portrait to pop more. So I'll just adjust the layer and to lighten the background and bring out the reds and balance it. Now, throughout this, I'll be transitioning between narrating and time lapse just for time's sake. Hey, CJ, the editor, butting in here. So when I start on a subject that I'm passionate about, I tend to ramble. So what should have been like a 10-minute demo turned into like a 45-minute art lesson, which I'm sure most of you aren't here for. So I'm just gonna chop this up and highlight the key points in the process with some succinct voiceover. And I'm also gonna leave the camera B footage out just because it doesn't lend any value and nobody really needs to see me doodling on the tablet. So here's the truncated version. So succinctly, I adjusted the background by brightening it, increasing the contrast, adjusting the exposure, color balance, and levels, and then I used a strong smudge tool to push the bloom back under the top layer, all with 0 issues. Next, I wanted to first test how well one of the most demanding Photoshop filters, the Smart Blur, worked, and I wanted to compare it to the new Neural filter, so I duplicated the subject layer, quickly selected her face, and applied a medium quality Smart Blur with a radius and threshold of about 30, and in real time, it took about 9 seconds to apply. And looking at the results, it did what the Smart Blur does. It smoothed out her skin in certain areas without completely destroying her features, and while I could tweak the filter, I was anxious to check out the skin smoothing Neural filter. So I selected my subject layer, launched the Neural filter interface, selected the skin smoothing filter, set the blur to 25 and the smoothness to 5, and hit OK. And that was real time. The filter was applied instantaneously, and the results are insanely good. Now, this wasn't just way faster than the Smart Blur, but way better. It smoothed and softened her entire face without destroying any features. The lines are still there, just softened, but because of the beautiful sheen or glow to her complexion, the angle and hardness of the lighting resulted in some really harsh highlights. But the Neural filter softened the lighting, resulting in more of a beauty lighting. Also, the filter didn't apply the entire image, it just inserted a masked layer of only the areas it processed, which I was able to edit before deleting the smart blur layer and merging the mask onto the subject. Okay, maybe a quick lesson here. I can't help myself. If you're doing portrait touch ups and the subject's eyes are dull or gray, simply add a layer and with a soft white brush paint in the eyes, then change the layer type to overlay and adjust the opacity to get the eyes to brighten and really pop. Now for the true test of performance of this iMac. I duplicated the subject and turned off all but the working layer, and now just using the smudge tool at 29% strength, I blended the entire portrait, and again, this isn't subtle airbrushing, I'm completely stylizing the image to give it an oil painting look by using the smudge tool to approximately simulate the brushstrokes I would use if this were an oil painting. The extremely impressive part is each one of these strokes is manipulating thousands of pixels at a time, and you can see in real time here, the system is redrawing them just as fast as I can work. For anyone who's done something like this on a 100 megapixel image knows this usually isn't the case. This whole process took me about 20 minutes, and again, this was just me being overly meticulous and not because I had to wait on the system. Let's just speed through it now.
Anymore. Think what we had disappeared long ago. I can't take back what we once had. Lying awake, can't get out of my head. You say all your dreams are gone. Are we gonna let this go or keep holding on? I have waited far too long, babe. I can't carry this weight anymore. Are we gonna let this go now? Can't carry this weight no more now.
So I got the results I wanted, not a single spinny rainbow circle to slow me down. Another tool that can be pretty demanding on a system is the liquefy filter, so I used it to very subtly change the model's expression without altering her features. I just wanted to give her a slight grin. And here in the interface, the image preview is actually a lower resolution copy of the working layer, so it goes very smoothly, but when I click OK, the system then has to redraw literally millions of pixels, so usually you get a slight delay, but not here. Again, it was instantaneous. So to see how far I could push the system, I needed to increase the pixel density, which I did by bringing in more pixels in the form of a stylish head wrap for our model. Or maybe it's not stylish, but it's about testing the system, not artistic style now. I roughly conformed the piece to the model with the warp and liquefy tools, which worked without issues. And then I again started blending with the smudge tool. However, if you look closely, now the system wasn't quite keeping up with my strokes. I was definitely ahead of the ability of the redraw rate. Until I finally encountered the dreaded rainbow of weight. So to quickly compensate, I just disabled the lower layer, which worked for a while, but eventually the circle reappeared and forced me to slow down. However, this time I compensated by simply increasing the cache level from 6 to 7, and I completed the work with no further issues. This is where the testing pretty much ended, and I finished up the piece with some purely artistic embellishes by manually painting in her pupils to fix her gaze and make the lighting glint symmetrical, just to create that linear perspective so her eyes seem to follow you wherever you go. And finally, I balanced the levels and color graded to make the tones warmer, closer to the burnt sienna and cadmium yellow oil paints I'd probably use for the base of her skin tones if this was an actual oil painting. Okay, enough of the artsy stuff. Let's talk about the technical side and just straight up, this is the best computer I've ever used for digital artwork, period. Now, admittedly, my digital artwork experience is extensive, but has dropped off almost entirely for over a year now. Can I build a PC that can match the level of performance I just demonstrated? Yes. Can I do it for $1,800? Maybe in a normal MSRP world. Can I do it for $1,800 with a display of this caliber? No. The closest, cheapest display to this is probably the 4K LG Ultrafine, and that's a $700 display, so subtract $700 from the PC build cost, and no, I can't build a competitive system for Photoshop anyway. To do it at this point in time, you need a Ryzen 5000 CPU. They're the only CPU that can beat the M1 single core performance right now, and an NVIDIA RTX graphics card. The graphics card isn't as important for Photoshop, and while AMD cards have better OpenGL performance in Photoshop anyway, the RTX cards have those AI tensor cores, which the neural filters in Photoshop were built for. And I just gotta say, I played with those filters some more, and it's still in beta. They're not all perfect, and some of the more advanced ones actually offload the processing to the cloud. They still are pretty cool, and again, if you want me to do a dedicated video to them, let me know in the comments. Now, the iMac performed great, but it's not perfect, and if I'm really doing my job, I need to point out the not so good. Yes, the 4.5K display is awesome. Great color accuracy, outstanding brightness, but the contrast was not what I expected to be, especially as an HDR display. Now, I might not have noticed this, but I was passing through the video to my main displays over here, and I noticed things on the video feed I wasn't seeing on the iMac screen, like this whole section of hair. On the iMac, I couldn't see it at all, and I actually missed it completely when I masked out the model, but it was very visible and distinguishable from the background on my main display, which only has a contrast ratio of 1,000 to 1. I can't say what the contrast ratio of the iMac display is because Apple doesn't officially publish that info, but it's an HDR LCD display with 500 nits of brightness, so following the HDR standards, it should have a peak contrast level of 1 million to 1, or maybe it's 20,000 to 1. I'm not 100% sure. This is why I don't review displays. My review would basically be, yep, looks good, or eh. Now, don't get me wrong. This one is definitely a yup, looks good verdict, but nothing is perfect, and maybe the contrast is fine, and I'm just not seeing it because of the shiny screen. Again, getting into the weeds here, but this is a video about content creation, and while doing fine detail work on a screen, it's distracting to see reflections on the screen. I had to do things to compensate, such as switching Photoshop to, well, the light mode and changing my bright red shirt for a dark gray one. I turned off all the lights in the room, but I still have a window over here. Now, if you're accustomed to working with a shiny screen, it's probably not too bad, and because it's a desktop, you can better control the lighting situation around it. Another thing I noticed was that when using the Wacom, you had to be very precise when grabbing the controls in the UI, like your strength or opacity sliders. When you use the mouse, you basically just need to be in the vicinity of the slider to grab it and move it. But when using the pen, I pretty much had to hit the slider control exactly. Now, the Wacom software is not M1 optimized yet, but it was very accurate and responsive while working on the image itself. I just noticed it was less responsive in the peripheral menus, which can be slightly frustrating when you're trying to change your brush mode and it takes 2 or 3 times to hit the drop down. Again, this might seem nitpicky, but as a creator, anything that slows down your workflow or just interrupts your flow is noticeable. I do use this Wacom on my PC all the time, and it's not an issue there, so I thought it was worth noting. But overall, those are very small negatives compared to the overall fantastic experience I had just with those 2 art projects. I'm not making excuses or dismissing the issues I noted, but working that smoothly at that resolution, yeah, I'll take the small negatives because nothing interrupts your creative juices more than waiting on a computer to catch up with you. And I know in my unboxing video I said I was probably gonna sell this iMac when I'm done working with it, but honestly, I may just keep it as a digital art workstation, even though I don't have time to just paint anymore. That's how much I liked it. Anyway, I hope you liked this video. If so, be sure to click that like and be sure to get subscribed to see more on the 2021 iMac. Next is 3D design, Blender, Maya, Cinema 4D, or maybe more neural filters? I don't know now. Also, this week I'm finally gonna finish out my setup and build out a 3rd set in the studio here. Yeah, I'm cramming 3 sets into a 10 by 15 foot room. It's gonna be mad. Anyway, I hope to see you for all of that. Until then, stay safe.